Hello everyone, I'm Sam Clift, and in this coloured pencil tip video I'm going to be showing you how I drew this young stag, building up the layers of coloured pencil to create textured fur and also the very different texture that is in the antlers. I really hope you enjoy the video. I'm starting off by actually lifting up some of the graphite so it doesn't show through the coloured pencil, which I do on every drawing, and then starting with a dark sepia and just mapping in the darkest parts of the stag's face, which I always start with the eyes, even though these are tiny, just leaving a little catch light and then going over the whole face just to work out where the darkest parts are, including the nostrils, under the chin, around the ears. And then I'm going in with a warm grey too, and just adding a base layer over the whole of the face because I know it's going to be this warm kind of grey brown colour. If I want it a little bit darker, I'm going over the same area a couple of times, not pressing any harder, very light hand, and then going in with the Bister colour, which is a really lovely neutral kind of lightish brown, and just adding this to the areas that I can see this colour all over the stag's face, again using a light hand, scribbly kind of motions and a little bit of a circular motion if you don't want any stop and start lines. Quite a lot of texture all over this stag's face, and so I'm just making sure that I get a little bit of that in to begin with. More detail goes in towards the end, so I'm not worrying too much about that yet. And then going in with the nugget, which is another lovely mid-brown, and I'm starting to build up through the colours, through the tones, all over the stag's face in the places that I can see that. So starting to build up where the areas are the darkest, but going in with a light hand, not pressing too hard. We certainly don't want to burnish and flatten the tooth of the paper. We want to get all of these lovely tones into the top of the nose as well, and using a scribbly and circular motion. And then I'm going in with the lovely Cocoa, which is a Pablo pencil, a lovely grey brown colour, and adding that to the centre of the face where it seems to be a little bit more grey than it is brown. So using circular motions, getting a really lovely uniform finish with no stop and start lines all over the areas that have this kind of colour in. So taking my time, looking at the reference photo, making sure that you're not rushing, and going in with the dark grey around the darkest parts on the nose. There's quite a lot of bluey grey in here, so just adding that kind of those colours in. Darkening up the darkest parts with the walnut brown as well. There's a lot of shadow on the side of the stag's face, in between the lips, under the chin, and by the eyes as well. There's quite a lot of brown there, and we can always darken it up a little bit more with the darker colours. So now I'm starting to go in with the dark sepia, one of my favourite colours. It's brilliant because it's just so versatile. It's fantastic for shadows, and it's also really good for glazing over the top, so you don't lose any detail, any of the colours, those browns that you've put in, but it just darkens the whole thing up. So really great for getting the values right. So going in with the Bister again, adding a little bit more brown, and then darkening up the nose with the black, making sure that it's as dark as it needs to be. That's the darkest part of its face, as well as the eyes. So making sure I'm just getting that in with the dark greys and the black, and also adding a little bit of brown to the nose, a little bit of the nugget to under the chin, and then just smoothing any pencil strokes with the warm greys. This is a warm grey 2, and then going under the chin and just adding a little bit there as well. Darkening up the eyes some more now. Those catch lights are way too big at the moment, so I'm just adding a little bit more darkness, just making sure that I'm getting that look right. So you can see the eyes are starting to pop now. Certainly not finished, but a little bit more in balance. You can see the rest of the face now is looking a little bit disjointed, so we need to add those mid-tones in to just bring it all together. Starting with the nugget, and actually starting now with a little bit of fur texture, using those tiny little pencil strokes just to get a little bit of texture in, using the nugget and the Bister as well to fill in the gaps between the highlights and the shadows, getting all of those mid-tones in, using a little bit of the warm grey, and using the same colours. It's a really great drawing to just use quite a small selection of pencil colours to get really lovely depth of tone. So adding the walnut brown and the dark sepia around the darkest parts of the nose, and then adding little hints of dark fur in the centre, and then smoothing off with the warm grey. So you're getting rid of the pencil strokes, you're softening them, and you're blending them together as well.
darkening up the nostrils some more, adding a hint of blue just to make it shine, and then darkening up some more with the dark sepia. Little details around the face, you can see it's starting to come together now, it's all starting to build up. Going in with the Van Dyke brown and the walnut brown to add a little bit of darker tones, as well as the warm greys around the top of the head. There was quite a lot of texture there, it's quite a kind of woolly texture. The fur wasn't going in one direction, so just looking at that on the reference photo and keeping that in mind. Adding a little bit of the warm greys under the chin, and then softening with the warm greys on the middle of the face as well. Blending all of that in together, you can see it does start to bring it together, blending all of those colours. Darkening up the darker parts, so the darker midtones around the cheek. Some little kind of dents and grooves in the top of the head, round by the eyes, and all of the top of that head where it's a kind of woolly texture. Just adding a little bit of darkness to the chin now, under the chin. Obviously there's going to be quite a lot of shadow there that's cast from the nose of the deer, so making sure that's in. All of these values have to be correct, they have to make sense. Darkening up under the chin a little bit more, making sure it's as dark as it needs to be. And then I'm just going to be adding a little bit of the warm grey to the ears. It's the same colours that I'm using for the majority of the stag here. Going in, adding the darkest parts. There's a little bit of brown around the outer ear, and then the inside of the ear is quite a lot darker, so I'm making sure the inside is as dark as it needs to be using the dark sepia too. You can see that's all starting to come together now, using the nugget to blend together, and then using the warm grey starting on the antlers. Again, the same colours, a base tone, then I'm adding the darker colours, building up through the browns to the darkest parts, adding the details and the shadows in last. So doing the same technique with the bigger antler, warm greys, building up through the browns, adding a little bit of detail, so going in with lines instead of kind of scribbly or circular, making sure you're getting that texture in, coming in with the warm greys as well, adding a little bit of shadow, and then darkening up the darkest parts, and making sure they are as dark as they need to be, so they really have form. It makes it look like the antler is rounded and that there's a lot of texture going on as well. So moving on to the neck of the deer, I'm going in with the warm greys to begin with, and building up with the warm grey 2 and then into the warm grey 4, putting it in the areas that have more shadow, building them up, not pressing any harder, still using a light hand, but just kind of mapping in where all those patterns in the fur are, those little creases and folds, making sure that now once we've got those lighter midtones in, that we darken up the areas like under the chin, so it all starts to make sense. And now we're going in with the nugget and starting to add some of the fur texture, little dashed lines following the direction of the fur, not pressing very hard, and then building up through the colours again, the bister, the nugget, the cocoa in the Pablo, and then building up through the Van Dyke brown, walnut brown, and then eventually into the dark sepia, which is again a great pencil to glaze to add those shadows, without losing any of the detail and any of the fur texture or colour underneath. It just darkens it up really nicely and uniformly. So adding the little fur texture, now we've added a few layers, we can start to add some more detail, building up through the browns. And then just using my kneadable eraser to just lift up some of the highlights, and then blending with the warm greys again. It's quite a lot of light on the left hand side of the stag's neck, and on the right hand side there's a lot more shadow cast by the head, and obviously the sun is coming from the left, so just bearing that in mind when you think about the light and the dark. So again, using these techniques again, going in with the bister, the nugget, the warm greys. This time I'm going to be adding fur texture, because this section of the deer was quite different to the neck. You could see the fur texture, and we don't want to lose any of that, so building up through the browns, adding a little bit of the burnt siennas as well, because there's quite a lot of red on the stag's back, And you are building up through the all the different colours, and you can see that starting to look like it's thick fur, and following the direction of the fur as well, using the light warm grey, so warm grey 2, warm grey 1, to blend these colours together to soften the pencil strokes, and then it gives a lovely soft fur texture. Darkening up any areas that need darkening with the dark sepia, missing out those little white patches on the back of the stag. We're going to add a little bit of grey to those just to make sure that they blend in nicely and aren't too crisp and white. Darkening up the shadows a little bit more, and then using the same technique for the rest of the stag as well, building up through the browns, following the direction of the fur, blending in between with the warm greys, darkening up the shadows with the dark sepia. You can see this whole area is quite dark. I'm glazing there with the dark sepia, a light hand, big circles, and then it just creates that lovely shadow over the whole piece. Going in with a base tone in some areas of the warm greys, softening the pencil strokes as well, and then darkening up the shadows, adding all of those lovely patterns in. Going in with the terracotta now, which is a lovely yellow orangey colour, which really brings out that kind of reddy orange in the top of the stag. Now the legs of the stag were a little bit more bluey grey, so I'm adding cold greys as well as the warm greys, using a little bit of a base colour, using the Bista and the Nugget, using some cold greys, the darker cold greys as well, to add a little bit of detail, so a real combination here. Darkening up the darkest parts, the shadow where the top of the leg, and then you can see I'm going in with a cold grey instead of a warm grey to blend the colours together. Just adding a little bit of darkness around the hoof. There's a shadow there. And using back and forth motions, still using a light hand so that I can build up through the layers. And then using that cold grey to blend and soften. Adding all of those patterns and textures that are within the leg. Softening those pencil strokes. Going in with the dark greys. Darkening up the darkest parts some more, just going in and tinkering with the values, making sure that they are correct, that they all make sense. Sometimes squinting your eyes will help you to see whether you've gone dark enough or whether you need to pull up some of the highlights. Adding a little bit of brown with the Bista, and then going in with the walnut brown to darken up, softening with the lighter greys, adding a little bit more brown, and then finishing with the darker greys, just darkening up the shadows. I'm now just going into the back of the deer. I've used the same technique over the whole of the deer. I'm going in with this kind of brown ochre, the terracotta, going in with the burnt sienna. I'm missing out those little dots all over the back, following the direction of the fur, little tiny pencil strokes using a light hand, and then building up through all of the browns, more red along the back, and then the grey browns through the centre and on the legs. So using the burnt sienna just to deepen the red on the stag's back. Going in with the dark sepia to darken up the shadows a little bit more and link the two sections. We don't want them to look too disjointed. It's all part of the same animal, although the kind of tones are quite different. Softening with the warm grey 1. You can see that really softens the pencil strokes, and then using the Nugget in this little section, which is a lot more kind of grey brown rather than reddy brown, and then again building up through the colours to blend them all together to make it all make sense. Darkening up the dark sepia and the walnut brown. You can see that took quite a lot of layers to build up, making sure that it looks like thick, dense fur. Same technique again, using the Nugget, following the direction of the fur, not pressing any harder. If you want a little bit more pigment, just going over the same area a few times just to build it up very, very slowly. Again, building up through the reds with the burnt sienna, a little bit of terracotta. There was a soft tail of the stag, so I'm adding the greys into that. There was quite a lot of white, so I'm really actually drawing in the shadows, not the white section, although white is very, very rarely white. There was quite a lot of white in the tail that I just decided to leave as the paper showing through. Building up the shadows with the warm greys, adding the browns to some of these sections of fur were a little bit longer, so in that case I'm using longer pencil strokes instead of the shorter pencil strokes. And then again building up through the browns and the greys, building up the shadows, adjusting some of the darker parts on the stag's back. It needs to look kind of anatomically correct, so you need to think about where the bones are, you know, the leg bones. Does it all make sense? The dents, the shadows, where the light would catch, where the light would bounce off, just making sure that it's nicely balanced. So adding some final adjustments with the dark sepia colour. Again, a really good dark neutral colour to add those shadows without losing the colours underneath. Use this colour all the time. It's probably the one I use the most. Building up some of the fur texture there. So using small pencil strokes and following the direction of the fur, adding a little bit of red with the burnt sienna, and then moving up through the browns into the Van Dyke, the walnut, and then eventually into the dark sepia. Making a little bit of adjustment to the tail, and then using my Tombow just to lift up a little bit of pencil to lift up the highlights and make all of the pencil strokes a little bit softer. Going in with the warm grey into the shadows, leaving that stripe of white down the stag's bottom area, and there's a flash of white there, so I want to leave that practically free. And then using the same techniques that I use for the front legs that I use into the back legs. So base colours, building up through the greys, little touch of brown, and then darkening up with the dark sepia as much as you need to get the shadows right. Softening with a little bit of the warm greys and the cocoa and the Pablo, and then darkening up with the dark grey just to make sure that we're creating a little bit of shadow. And there's the finished stag. Just zooming in a little bit so that you can see the detail, seeing how it's all come together, and then zooming out for the entire look.
I hope you enjoyed today's video and got some helpful tips on how to build up realistic looking thick fur. If you want to see the real-time tutorial where I go through it step by step, then it is available in my online membership, Discovering the Artist Within You. I will put the link in the description box where you can find a lot more information on that, where there's a massive library of tutorials like this one that you can really get stuck in and improve your pencil work. I also have a really beautiful community of artists in a Facebook group, so if you haven't already, come over and join Artist Community. It's a really safe, friendly space where you can share your work, get some help and tips and inspiration if you need it, and I also run regular free workshops over there too. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe and share it with your friends who you think might enjoy it too, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.